What's going on, boys? It is day number 20 of reading through the book of Matthew. Today, we are going to be looking at some more just amazing stories that Jesus shares with his disciples and with the people that are around him. So the topics we're going to be looking at for today's chapter is, first off, probably one of the most interesting topics in this chapter. It's the parable of the workers in the vineyard, and then Jesus predicting his death for the third time, and then a mother's request, and then we finish off with two men receiving sight. So I didn't talk about this yesterday, but at the end of chapter 19, one of the last things that Jesus finishes out with in his speech to his disciples is in verse 30. He says, "But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first." So the reason why I didn't particularly talk about this is because it wouldn't really make sense if we didn't read this parable. So I waited till today. So at the end of 19, Jesus shares this particular line, and this parable that he shares with his disciples gives a clear indication as to why this line means that. So why God chooses the last to be first and the first to be last. So this parable talks about how Jesus kind of compares this the kingdom of heaven to a landowner who has a field and actually has a vineyard, and he goes out and he finds people to hire to work in his vineyard, and then he would have them work, and then he goes in and says, "Hey, if you work in my field, I'll pay you a denarius," which was, at the time, it was a usual daily wage of a laborer. And so they would go out and they would work, and it says that this landowner went out about 9 o'clock in the morning to go out and find these workers to work for him. And he went out at 9 o'clock, about noon, and then he went out for the last time about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so as the end of this day comes, they're getting ready to get paid, and this is the kind of the story and this kind of connection that really helps us to understand this verse that Jesus shared at the end of chapter 19. So I'm going to read verse 8 through 16, which says, "When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and received a denarius. So when those who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. Those who were hired last worked only an hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of work in the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." So I'm going to share a little footnote from the Harmony of the Gospels book. I've really been using this book to help me understand some of the things that Jesus says instead of just looking it up online, because I remember when I read this book over the summer, we only covered a small portion of it. So this book has really helped me to dive into what Jesus means in these parables. And so one of them, I'll share my notes first. So based off our discipleship in Christ, we will be rewarded, and then God can do as he pleases because he is holy and righteous. And so for my book here, this parable of the landowner, it's only found in the book of Matthew. It serves to illustrate the truth from verse 30 in chapter 19, that the last are first and the first are last. And it illustrates the reality that while all disciples will be rewarded, the order of rewards will be determined by the spirit in which the disciple served. So it depends on what that particular disciple did. So in other words, when you become a disciple in Christ, I think the first thing that we need to do is understand what you're getting yourself into. Because a lot of times what happens is when we get into discipleship and we get far along into it, and someone else comes along and they get rewarded in a similar way that you do, that shouldn't create any sort of judgment. That shouldn't create any sort of jealousy or kind of just anger in your mind. You should be, happy that, the fact that this owner, that God that has called them is giving them what they need. And then jealousy, I think the word jealous, it kind of gives a description. It says the normal word for jealousy is not used. Rather, in an idiomatic phrase, is your eye evil? The complainer had a grudging eye, while the landowner had a generous eye. The lesson in the verse is that God is sovereign. He can do as he pleases, and he pleases will always be right, just, and fair. So one way to think about it is that God, can do as he pleases because he is God. He's holy and he's righteous and he knows everything. But he's also good, and he does what's good in the eyes of man. And I think a lot of times some of the things that he does, our human minds and our free will and things that we get placed in our minds by the world can view God's decisions as bad. And the reason for this is because, we don't understand. And that's not the way our minds were meant to comprehend it. And that when things happen, if we don't, have an understanding of the scriptures and have an understanding of God, we don't know God, we don't know Christ, there are going to be things that happen that kind of can upset us. And that's what's happening here with this worker. He says, why is it that, because I've worked for, a full day's work and these other servants have only worked for an hour, why are we getting paid the same? And while in most cases, that would be viewed as, because you worked more, I'll pay you more. But you have to remember that the landowner originally asked these workers that, hey, if you'll come and work my field, I'll pay you a denarius. And he said that to all the workers that he hired, so the ones at 9 in the morning, one about noon, and the last one. So he said the same for all of them. So, he's being equal and being fair to all of them. And so it's a very interesting story. So, and then, the last to be first and the first to be last. So, it's always a very interesting thing. And, when he says it in chapter 19, it's referring back to the rich in the kingdom of God. So it's, saying that, sometimes the people that you would think are less of value because maybe how much money they have will be before you because they have more faith. They have more faith in you. They have more faith in God. So if anything, that should put us that, your faith in God is what matters. And that's what's going to get you to the front of that line where God can say that you have done a great job. So Jesus has predicted his death twice. And so now he has predicted a third time. So you would think by now the disciples would have caught on to this, that this is actually going to happen because he said this 3 times. And in this one, he actually, says what's going to happen to him. He says that, he'll be handed over to the Gentiles to be mocked, to be flogged, and crucified. So to be mocked, to be made fun of, to people to throw insults at him, to be flogged. So this is like beaten. They would, have these like whips that they, beat him with the whips, and it would tear his skin open, and he would be bleeding everywhere, and then he'd be crucified on the cross. And that was, at the time, and it really still is, the worst death that someone could die. And then he says on the third day he'll be raised to life. He is literally giving a preview of what is going to happen at the end of his ministry, at the end of his time on the earth. He's literally saying it to them word for word. Like, this is as like basic as it's going to get. Like, you could literally tell this to a 5-year-old and you would think that the disciples would understand this, but they don't. They don't. And it's hard because this isn't something they want to believe. So, a very interesting thing, but I believe that the crucifixion of Jesus comes up in a few later chapters. And so, this last section before the receiving of sight to these 2 men is about a mother's request. So, the 2 of the disciples, mother of Zebedee, those 2 sons, so I think it's James, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but she has come to Jesus, and she has asked him a favor, and Jesus replies, I'm going to read verse 21 through 23 real quick. It says, Jesus says, what is it you want? He asked. She said, grant that one of these 2 sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. You don't know what you're asking for. Jesus said to them, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. Excuse me. These places belong to those whom they have been prepared by my Father. So let me turn to my this page in my book here, and a little bit of notes that I wrote down. In other words, it is not up to us to tell God where to place us. It's not up to us to say, hey, God, I want to be there. Put me there. Like, it's not really how it works. And then Jesus points to his suffering as the cup that man must endure. So Jesus says, you'll drink from my cup, but as far as you being at the right and left in my kingdom, that's not up to for me to decide. That's up to what the Father wants. It's up to what he says, my Father in heaven. That's his decision. And ultimately, that decision is made based off of how you live your life, based off your discipleship to Jesus. And so one of the things that it says in verse 22, then we'll read a little footnote from my book here. when Jesus says you don't know what you're asking, this is basically referring to the modern day translation. It says they do not yet understand the nature of Jesus' kingdom. He redirects their attention to his coming, the suffering. And then this cup is an Old Testament referring. So this cup that Jesus is referring to, he's basically saying that, yes, this is the cup that you want to drink from, you will receive from my suffering. He says, however, what happens after that really depends on how faithful you remain in me, how much you're really going to place your faith in me to say, I'm going to trust you through all the tough times, even if I lose everything, or if I get made fun of, or beaten, or whatever it is, I'm going to trust you through all times. And Jesus says in verse 28, says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Christ is the true servant of the living God that gave his life for our redemption. So, Christ came because he knew that man could not save himself. And the only way that this could be done is Christ came to serve. Christ came to show us how to live. He didn't come to say, hey, I'm God. You have to come worship me. I'm the one that you were looking for. Come worship me. Come do this. Jesus went around to serve. We look at all of the things that Jesus did on his ministry, from through his disciples, from the tax collectors to the fishermen, to going and eating at a tax collector's house, to healing all these people, to breaking that bond between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. And it's just a very crazy thing that Jesus is pointing out here. So understand that the true cup that Jesus tells us that we can have is from his suffering, his love for us poured out. I think about communion a lot. Once a month, our church does that, to where we remember the communion of Jesus breaking the bread to represent his body, and the blood, and the cup being his blood of the new covenant. And so lastly, in the last section, it's a pretty short one, but very similar to what things we've seen about two men receiving sight. They say, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus asks them, says, what do you want me to do? And they said, we want to have sight. And Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and they were received their sight. So they know that Jesus is, the Son of God, that he was Lord, the Son of David. He was the one that had been promised in the Old Testament to come and fulfill those promises that God had made to David, to be the Messiah, to come and to free man from their chain of sins, to really point us to the direction that we need to be going. And so that is today's word. I hope that message encouraged you. I know it was a lot, and we jumped back and forth a little bit, but I hope it encouraged you. So we are in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 8. The title is called A Good Reward, and today is November 22nd. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do. Lord, it is good to understand that when I'm successful at obeying you, there will be a reward. You are not blind to my intentions, which means you see me and know my heart. That feels good and bad. Good, because I'm confident that I want to do right by you, but also that you see the snippets of my wickedness still in me. Blot out my sin, God, and continue to sanctify me by the work of your Spirit. Let me bear good fruit for your kingdom and extend your glory throughout the earth. So, first and foremost, we must first understand that whether we are in the beginning of our walk with Christ, or if we've been doing it for a long time, we must remember why we are in it. There are going to be things that happen to us, things that God works in many people's lives that we don't understand, but we know that God is doing it for the best of them, because God knows us. God knows what's best for us, and sometimes we go through some tough points in our life, and we don't understand, but the way I look at it is that God will break you to make you. He will form you into the person that you were made to be, because he knows that through these worldly actions, you will not become that person, so you must be broken to be made right. And it may take a little while, but it is ultimately through following Jesus. He will point us in the direction that we need to go. He will walk with us through all times and have compassion on us and love for us, because he came to serve and not to be served. That is today's word. I hope that you guys have had a great Saturday, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Peace out, boys.